A barely thinking ape hoses cultural anthropology and comes up with the manospheric hooker theory of history, Part 1. There are thousands of crappy videos in aid of dubious projects. So I generally have to be paid to care about any of them. And lo, my latest hire, to examine what's going on with Stardusk's half-hour video protectors, providers, Nazis, and prostitutes on his channel Thinking-Ape. Considered one of the founding members of the Men Going Their Own Way movement online, Stardusk is still a manosphere YouTuber with a lot of bizarre pseudoscientific views. Which is SOP in the manosphere, but he's even weirder and more right-wing than Jordan Peterson. He's on the gender separationist side and promotes black pill ideology. You can find a friendly sort of bio at Incels Wiki, which is a site run by incels, so be wary. And he's influential. His site has over 100,000 subscribers and his videos get tens of thousands of views. I've kept up on this subject generally and written on it often. For a starter, see my article A Psychology of Men. A critical review of Robert Glover's No More Mr. Nice Guy, which links to my other articles on manosphere ideology before and since, including how to do men's rights rightly, so the rabbit hole begins there. One should also explore the flip side, my discussions of feminism. Those articles also survey a lot of the science I will be discussing here, and you'll find more in my article on modern gender panic. But the best studies on the manosphere of late are Alice Capel's Collapse Feminism, the online battle for feminism's future. She also touches on it several times on her excellent YouTube channel, Donna Zuckerberg's Not All Dead White Men, Classics and Misogyny in the Digital Age, and the Routledge anthology Male Supremacism in the United States, from patriarchal traditionalism to misogynist incels and the alt-right. As it takes far less time to make a bogus claim than it does to explain why it's bogus, analyzing and correcting all of Stardusk's mistakes here will be a Herculean effort. Clearing these Augean stables will therefore take 2 long articles. First, I will introduce the video and explain some important underlying concepts and how they pertain. Then in part 2 I fisk the rest of the video, and give my final assessment, with all of these principles and points already established. The video and its conceits. Stardusk's video, Protectors, Providers, Nazis and Prostitutes, but not Oxford commas, is now over 10 years old but still occasionally getting views and comments, and it is as of this moment number 2 on a Thinking-Ape playlist compiled in 2021. It also reflects themes he repeats in other videos, and is representative of his ideology and methodology. In fact, it is a nutshell case for the entire Men Going Their Own Way ideology, so if you want to understand that, you'll get up on that watching this. Yes, it's crap. But all MGTOW literature is. It is quite typical, for example, that this video's bibliography includes amateur male supremacists and red pillars, alongside such eminently reliable sources as the Daily Mail, so we know what kind of literature Stardusk takes seriously. That's a bad sign. But from a critical thinking perspective, what is most notable about this is the preference for linking to unreliable or paraphrastic discussions of scientific studies, but not the actual scientific studies, much less studies with contrary or qualifying results. You will soon see why this is important. Failing to critically read the actual science is a common failure mode among ideological demagogues. I've documented examples from Jordan Peterson to anonymous vegan Click Mills. So what's this video's thesis? Female mate selection, sick, has today become dysfunctional because of the decline of the supremacy role that used to be enjoyed by cavemen. Cue here, literally, a classical artwork, shown above, depicting a caveman hunting with a bow for his baby cradling woman. Or, correction, I think Stardusk wanted an image of that but couldn't find it, and hoped instead we wouldn't notice that the woman in the painting he chose, Prehistoric Man Hunting Bears, by Emanuel Benner, 1892, is holding a rather skull-crushing mace in a combat stance ready to protect herself, and her helpless babe and elder cowering beside her. So let's remember, man, in the 19th century was a gender plural inclusive term. Benner did not mean a man. But men, i.e. a man and his wife. Why this is funny is that Stardusk's entire shtick is to argue that, biologically, women can't protect themselves or their families, and so evolved to exploit men to do it instead, and to illustrate this weird theory he chooses an image of a woman entirely capable of protecting herself, and her babes and elders. You know. Like they do. It's also funny to see Stardusk claim over this image that, back then, without technology, men were the sole providers and protectors. It's just biology, you know. Except that, the mace the woman is holding is a technology, a rather well-built force multiplier. Humans have always been distinguished by a reliance on technologies. This is not some new thing that just happened. And trust me. Any average wild or healthy woman can crush a bear's skull with a mace. You just need speed and daring, and, ideally, a team, to wear down and distract the bear in order to chess move a coup de grace to its skull. A common failure mode of misogynistic ideologies is to confuse humans need to work together to accomplish things, a fact entirely divorced from gender, with women as individuals need men as individuals to accomplish things, a claim that does not track with fact. Benner's painting depicts men and women working together as equals. both using, surprise, force-multiplying technologies. Benner was a better anthropologist than Stardusk. Here Stardusk even claims that it was men, not women, who were skilled in building shelters and thus providing for and protecting their women. Ironically, I doubt Stardusk could do this. Yet the Thai woman in the video I just linked is smaller than me, and she entirely builds a shelter, from scratch, on her own. The skills she displays there are local and ancient. This is a far more accurate example of how cave women were. And it destroys Stardusk's entire thesis. Women do not need men. They just, like men, benefit from cooperation. But there is no biological fact here about men being the shelter builders. Women clearly evolved to be entirely capable of doing that as well. Women hunted with weapons just like men. Women made shelters with tools just like men. Division of labor in the ethnographic record tracks to no clear sex distinctions, except one: men did tend to be assigned the role of hunting bigger game, which was arguably a display of value, but it wasn't the only way for men to display value even then. Tribes always survived on a dependence just as much on women's labor, who worked as much as men, and provided as much as men. Some cultures gender labor more than others. Some cultures gender labor one way, some an entirely different way. For example, in some cultures hide processing and toolmaking are the man's domain, in others, the woman's. One of the principal causes of Evopsycha's endless bullshit is the ignoring of actual scientific evidence of diverse cultures and how this actually disproves the biological determinism that has taken a logical root in the Evopsych community. If you want to make an argument for biological determinism, you cannot do it while ignoring all the evidence of ethnography and cultural anthropology, and you can barely even do it then, since you still have to rule out convergent cultural evolution before you can get to a conclusion of genetic causes, and if all you have left after that is a small or moderate effect size, leaving a majority of subjects as outliers, you still don't have determinism. I have already thoroughly covered the rampant pseudoscience in evolutionary psychology elsewhere, in Is 90% of all Evopsych false? That field's conclusions are often patently irrational and even anti-empirical. It ends up becoming an uncritical and largely faked-up ideological tool of racists and sexists. So, needless to say, Stardusk loves Evopsych. Like any Nazi loves social Darwinism or any American slave owner loved the Bible. It's bullshit all the way down. But ironically, or maybe not, Stardusk never even gets anything in evolutionary psychology right, either. He basically just makes shit up, calls it Evopsych, even though it is backed by literally no scientific study whatever, not even a crappy one, and then declares his conclusions science. The same sort of thing creationists and flat earthers and climate deniers do. This all starts with his bogus accounting of how primitive peoples gendered their labor. No science is cited here. Just his own imagination, circularly consulting what he thinks must be true in order to prove what he thinks must be true is true. Any actual investigation of the science would have exploded his entire thesis. Indeed, serious Evopsych researchers have already been calling out manosphere abuses and misrepresentations of their own science, for example, and of particular relevance to Stardusk's thesis, see Louis Bashad and Sarah Johns. The use and misuse of evolutionary psychology in online manosphere communities, the case of female mating strategies, Evolutionary Human Sciences, 2023. Let's pause for a moment to talk about violence. The only thing we can credit here is that it is true that biological sex has differentiated male and female hormone regimes, which create divergences in puberty, to the effect that men are, in some sense, hyperviolent, brains and bodies kitted out to be disposable combat machines, whether against threats or prey, and women are, in some sense, not, their brains and bodies instead being kitted out to be disposable baby machines. Chromosomally, the default sex for everyone is female, so the female body is mostly just what you end up with if you don't meddle with its biochemistry. This is illustrated by people with AIS, androgen insensitivity syndrome, simply making the body insensitive to androgens, the chemicals that convert a generic body into what we call a male. One results in a person with a full XY chromosome, often a transphobe's definition of a man, developing an entirely stereotypical female body, breasts, body, vagina, and all, with a few exceptions. For example, they don't develop a womb, since the coding for that is on the X chromosome where the broken Y blocks its function. So men are a deviating design from the natural baseline. Which means we should consider how male sex development differs from female sex development if we want to look for any hypotheses of biological determinism. And remember, it would just be hypotheses at that point. You then need abundant converging evidence to establish any of those hypotheses are true. And ideological misogynists don't do evidence, really. Despite huffing constantly that it's all they do, it's almost never anything they do. Case in point, Stardusk is naively reacting to the fact that the male-developed body is principally for enhanced violence, but his reaction is naive because it assumes, via the black or white fallacy, that this means women are not built for violence, and that nature operates by black and white sex division. Everyone is for one thing, everyone else another, and that violence is therefore, simply, what men are for. None of that is true. Stardusk is the sort of person who might think women on average are shorter than men means all women are shorter than all men, and therefore all men exist for the purpose of being tall. In fact, sexual genetics is entirely driven on the principle of bell curve dynamics. Nature builds plenty of tall, strong women and short, weak men. It hedges its bets. So there is no way to argue biological determinism by sex differentiation. If a job requires you be tall, fewer women will qualify than men, but plenty of women will still qualify. Therefore, you can draw no conclusion about whether women will qualify for the job. You simply just have to measure height. You can say there is a sort of biological determinism surrounding height, although it's pretty weak. Hardly anyone gets rutted into job specialties by height, but not sex, and I am skipping over gender here for now, but remember, gender is not sex, and there are also more than two sexes, as people with AIS demonstrate, as do other intersex bodies. The same goes for anything else you want to measure, whether it's physical strength or even emotionality. In fact, when you check, apart from that one thing, muscularity and propensity to violence, which I'll get to, statistically men differ from women by only 10 percentiles on any metric, like height or felt intensity of emotions, and their peaks and tails hugely overlap, by around 90%. That's actually quite small a difference objectively. And since combat depends as much on speed, skill, and tools, knives, for example, long predates civilization, muscularity and propensity to violence are not defining. This does mean averages won't overlap, e.g., more men will be capable of becoming good fighters than women, but only by a percentage, and extreme outliers won't overlap, e.g., super absurdly strong men will not have many counterparts in the cis woman population, but being extreme outliers, they can tell us nothing about sex or gender generally. For example, almost no man is Arnold Schwarzenegger. So you can learn nothing about men from the example of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Consequently, any biologically determinist argument you made about him, like, he's more likely than other men to end up in, and excelling at, a weightlifting culture, would not apply to men, almost none of whom, statistically, even end up in, much less excelling at, a weightlifting culture. And to illustrate with a different case, men and women don't significantly vary in IQ, yet men do tend more often, albeit still rarely, to have extreme IQs. And yet this has no substantial effect on any metrics of even those men's competence or success, as I documented in Luck Matters More Than Talent, much less any measurable effect on men's competence or success. These basic failures of logic I suspect are one of the two main drivers of all bigot culture, sexists, racists, classists, and the like, the other being an ironic disregard for Shapiro's law, facts don't care about your feelings. Bigots, especially ideologically grounded bigots, actually disregard facts in pursuit of their feelings. They feel certain things are true, and get emotionally triggered whenever their feelings about things are challenged by facts, and in consequence they flee from facts, avoid facts, invent facts, or try to make facts go away by every apologetic device they can desperately contrive, usually on the fly. And failing all that, they just get angry and smash things, like hurling insults or trying to down your likes or even your web server. Stardusk illustrates this in the first minute and a half of his video. He has emotionally attached himself to a delusionally constructed identity, a functionally religious belief about what men and women essentially are and are like, which in result causes him to advance what he merely feels as factual, while forgetting to instead check actual facts first. Even though that is a fundamental requirement of rationality, see the scary truth about critical thinking. So there is a kernel of truth in the fact that humans evolved for a somewhat sex-differentiated skew in violence perpetration, and did so possibly in biological reaction to the disposability of men. One man can impregnate 10 women, but 10 women can still only have the same number of children. So, by nature's cruel logic, men aren't that important. It can afford to burn more of them off. This results in a disparity. Cis women tend to have wombs, while cis men tend to be hyperviolent. Men are built to jump into the fray and be chosen for dangerous missions because they are disposable. However, this is not what MGDOW mean by, men are the disposable sex, since in this sense, so are women, they just more usually get killed by babies. I'll get to that. But again, bell curves, remember? The difference in capability can be small, that woman with her mace is almost as deadly as the man by her side, and the variability is extensive, in fact it is greater within each sex than across them. Men differ from other men more than they differ, overall, from women, and women differ from other women more than they differ, overall, from men. And these curves all substantially overlap. So nature was more ambivalent about all this than the biological determinists want her to have been. She found an advantage in some skew in this enhanced for violence trait, just as she found an advantage in a slight skew in sexuality, for homosexuality appears to be a selected trait, too, as it remains at roughly the same percentage across even widely divergent species over, evidently, eons. But it was selected specifically to be relatively rare. This means it is not possible to say gay men are not men, as if they are deviant. To the contrary, they are as purposeful a make and model for men as crazy Hulk weightlifters like Arnold, not the norm, but also fully intended. Just like a short man is not a man, nor even not a representative man, since a man entails many more traits than mere height, so, too, gay men and non-hulking men. It is therefore not possible to advance any sweeping biological determinist argument like Stardusk is attempting. Which brings me to the final point any critic must grasp here before continuing: culture is a construct. It is, itself, a technology. The enormous diversity of cultural structures across the ethnographic record proves this, something everyone should be forced to take a college course in cultural anthropology to realize, as I did. And one thing science has established is that Western culture is actually weird. Literally. It is not representative of human culture's past, but extremely divergent. Which means our culture, which people like Stardusk sometimes treat as a biological norm, is actually not. Which actually undermines his project. If we are supposed to return to our biological norm, then we should abandon modern Western culture, which is not what Stardusk wants. Obviously his thesis is wrong from its very first premise: we should not be valorizing some ideal biological norm. We do far better as a civilization the more we get away from that norm, and thus defy rather than obey our biology. So Stardusk is wrong at even the most basic level of his thinking. To illustrate why this matters, consider the hyperviolence attribute of developmentally male-sexed bodies and brains. Its principal outcome difference between men and women is that in most communities men commit acts of violence at a far higher rate than women. For example, in America men commit 4 times as many violent crimes, a difference of not 10 but 300 percentiles. That is an enormous disparity in outcome. But if you dig into the sociological studies you'll find this disparity varies a lot according to social rather than biological factors. And even in the worst cases, where we see men engaging in violent crime 10 times as often as women, still only a very small minority of men are implicated. Biology is not destiny. Violence is not even natural in the sense that Stardusk means, it is rare and thus atypical, and modulated more by culture than sex. Indeed, over the long arc of history, violence has been in steady decline. Which means it is not biologically determined. Another fact about violence is that it tends only to be productive when not pursued individually but in cooperation. Armies, not lone wolves, win wars, and its tribes, not lone hunters, who reliably defeat predators and process prey. So to center violence as being a man might signal an unusually violent mind in Stardusk, rather than a more typical male mind, which will instead balance cleverness, competence, compassion, cooperativeness, and contemplativeness with any physical readiness to action, as will plenty a woman have done. Stardusk's ideology thus reflects certain disturbing beliefs about himself rather than objective facts of the world. This will also become clear in his even greater, and equally disturbing, centering of sex as the only reason to interact with women. Which gets us to the real crux of the issue. Let's pause for a moment to talk about culture. Nature hates you. She built you to be disposable. Women and men. Pregnancy wrecks women. Fighting wrecks men. You all wear out and die eventually, and right soon in the scheme of things. You are all throwaway sacks of mindless, meaningless genes. Once we figured this out, we rebelled against nature's callous maleficence and started fixing everything we could, with technologies, from those force multipliers, to aqueducts, medicine and roads, eyeglasses and mechanical hearts, all the way to cultural constructs, from democracy to science, and pursuing more meaningful ends, from discovery of the world and ourselves, to the enjoyment of life, love, and company, all the way to the act of creation itself, from art and engineering to relationships and communities. Nature is a shit guide. And her designs are often vile. You should rarely want to emulate her or return to her. The correct path is to escape her, through culture and technology, and build something better, more humane, more satisfying to the sentient. This does not mean we cannot roll with nature better or learn from nature or even enjoy nature, suitably managed. Judo defeats its opponent by rolling with their own inertia and using it against them. Which requires learning how they move, and how to leverage it to a different outcome. We can master nature the same way, learning how she works, and using the way she already works to our advantage, and even enjoyment. But this is not the same thing as returning to a state of nature or obeying nature. We absolutely will not do well for ourselves doing either of those things. This is the first lesson Stardusk failed to learn. The second is its corollary, that we do this with culture. Culture is a technology, and technology entails a culture. Gender is a tool, something we invented. Sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. We aren't terribly rational as a species and are mostly ignorant most of the time, so most of the things we make are not well made, particularly the more complex and difficult they are to make or change. Our ideas about gender have mostly been bad ideas. But bad ideas can be replaced with good ones. The Scots figured out men can wear skirts. The punks of the 80s figured out men can wear makeup. What we think is appropriate for this or that gender doesn't have to be that way. We can retool it, or discard it. Hence you will indeed find that a central tenet of MGDOW, which is fundamentally a toxic grievance culture, is that men are the disposable sex, but in the sense of not being needed, and we are supposed to blame women for this. In fact, men aren't disposable in Stardusk sense, because they're people, and people are always useful. They can produce and trade and work together to accomplish things. While in nature's sense, women are just as disposable, nature just wants them to burn themselves out replacing everyone with babies. The original labor, misery, and danger was all commensurate between early men and women. In nature, pregnancy is permanently crippling, while roughly 1 in 100 women will eventually die from pregnancy or childbirth. Without modern science, the average single-birth mortality is in the low hundreds per 100,000, compounded over 5 pregnancies, the number required to maintain a population with standard infant and child mortality rates above 50%. And this produces around 1 in 100 women eventually dying from pregnancy, worse than men dying by violence. And yet look how much culture can change that, and look at how miserably the supposedly great United States has uniquely failed at this. And that is culture, not just medical equipment and techniques, but attitudes and values, leading to different decisions regarding the allocation of resources. This is why over 40 times more women die from birthing children in the US than in the Netherlands today. There are no relevant biological differences between those women. That difference is all culture. Just as with endemic violence against women. But assume you are more concerned about all the things killing more men, such as homicide, suicide, labor accidents, vehicular accidents, misadventure, and so on. These kill women, too, but men, a lot more. Although contrary to legend, war and policing kill almost no one in developed countries now, e.g. actual combat deaths per year for the US military is comparable to lightning strikes, and non-accidental police deaths is only slightly higher. Even adding suicide and accidental deaths, policing isn't even in the top 20 deadliest occupations, nor is serving in the military. But the other categories are substantial, with annual deaths in the tens of thousands. Did women cause any of that? No. Will isolating yourself from women change any of that? No. Will collaborating and cooperating with women change at all? Yes. Because notice the massive cultural variation in those statistics. In Germany, Japan, Norway, and New Zealand, for example, women and men are equals in homicide statistics. These peoples are not biologically different from Americans. So the difference is cultural. And that means we could change it. It requires changing the culture. And just as it was in those countries, this requires full collaboration between both genders to build and maintain the corresponding society. Women everywhere are keen to do that. MTO are resisting it. They are therefore causing their own harm, like a drowning man in a rage irrationally fighting off his rescuers. Because, in reality, the place where I live, quite a lot women are actively working to reduce all of those statistics. Example. We could, help them. Gendered suicide also varies a lot by country, but in this case owing to conditions and ideologies. But developed societies actually care a lot about it, they are not ignoring this. You can Google it and find countless studies and articles taking it seriously. And if you actually cared about it, you would know that, in fact, in developed societies women and men attempt suicide in roughly equal numbers. So the disparity is in success. What is the leading difference there? About a third of the difference may be guns. Take them away, and successful suicides drop by the thousands. In America, over half of all gun deaths are suicides. Owning a gun is more likely to kill you than an intruder. But the mere fact that, despite supposedly being the stronger sex, more men own guns to kill themselves with. Statistically, women are less interested in guns. And that's a cultural thing. If you want to lower the male suicide rate to be comparable to the female suicide rate, you will have to look at what is actually causing the difference. MTO do not want to face that fact. Which is significant. Because the number one, and even associated, difference in suicide rate is strength of intent, men are more intent on success, which is a product of gender differences in seeking mental health care. Indeed, if you want to address the underlying causes of attempting suicide in the first place, in other words, if you care about people and not just men, the issue is, across the board, mental health care. Substantial gains could be reached if society paid for more of that. But even just with what we have, culture decides who benefits from it more. No one else is blocking men's access to it any more than women's. To the contrary, men are doing this to themselves, and each other. Male culture teaches men to hide their emotions and not admit to even needing mental health care. That will be denigrated by men, hence even by themselves, as girly and thus unmanly, and weak and thus inferior, rather than responsible and courageous, which makes everything worse. Male culture is what has to change. MGDOW don't want to hear that, either. It's the irrational drowning man all over again. One can also observe here that Stardusk's latent anarcho-libertarianism opposes any actual cooperative solution like public funding of mental health care, even though that is the only way it can be available to any significant number of men. But male culture underlies even that irrational hostility to cooperative venture. Women are 50 years ahead of men on this realization. In the latter half of the 20th century, toxic femininity came to be increasingly called out and abandoned by women. They've been sorting themselves out for generations now. It's time for men to step up and do the same. Even if we look at conditions and ideologies as factors in gendered suicide, the latter are literally culture, what the men killing themselves learned or were taught to believe, and the former are a product of culture. Women and men suffer the same rate of conditions, like poverty, loneliness, bullying, and other factors, so the gendered difference in outcome is coming from how men react to those conditions. Which is a function of male culture. White male culture in particular has become increasingly dysfunctional, having previously been based on supremacy and dominance, on a basis of exploitation of the labor of women and minorities, and a privileged, line-jumping, competition-quashing, access to resources, opportunities, and avenues of success. Greater equality thus makes the cultural assumptions of, especially but not only white, men no longer functional. They need to change. White men need to learn how to navigate society and their own lives and expectations from women, minorities, and other male cultures beyond the US who already learned how to live without advantage. They also need to team up with these groups for common goals rather than hate and fight them. For example, throughout childhood, prioritizing social, emotional, and communication skills and the importance of social bonding and building deep friendships, not only outside the family but even within it, would have a substantial impact on suicide rates by reducing isolation and increasing cooperative coping. Abandoning unrealistic expectations, such as no longer assuming that, because you are white or a man that you should be getting things like jobs and wealth and respect, and instead realizing these things have to be earned, you have to actually be respectable, competent, and industrious, because you are competing with everyone now. And discovering the true enemy, the thing actually suppressing men's opportunities and advancement, capitalist plutocracy, and finally uniting against that, rather than fake bugbears, whether women, or immigrants, or wokeness, for example, none of which are actually the things getting in your way. Which entails realizing that any actual unjust barriers to your earning jobs, wealth, and respect, are not coming from women, but from political decisions you could be doing more about. For instance, women are not causing massive societal income disparity or the decline of rural America. Our collective political decisions are doing that. MGTOW should stop hating women and make more friends, and join more labor unions and pursue more socialist, hence, cooperative, solutions to the failure modes of capitalism, as becomes clear from how better off men are in more balanced socialist societies. This will in fact reduce suicide rates both structurally, by reducing its economic causes, and directly, by anchoring men's satisfaction in action towards something greater than themselves, thereby anchoring them more to living than merely existing, or pursuing sex, as well as generate countless other positive improvements on your life and society as a whole. Likewise, deaths by vehicular accident and misadventure, disparities in these are caused by men making poor decisions more often than women. For example, men speed more, they drink and drive more, and they are more reckless drivers overall. Responsibility is being undervalued by men. Hence in 2004, male drivers caused 94% of accidents that caused death or bodily harm. And this was not because men drive more, hours driven between genders differ by less than a third, as do the collisions they cause. Indeed, this effect is witnessed across all mortality categories. Men make bad decisions. They smoke more. They engage in reckless activities more. They avoid preventive healthcare more. This is a problem with male culture. And it plays a role even in causing excess workplace deaths, from the same excessive recklessness, disregarding safety measures as unmanly or ignoring safety by acting more impulsively. Men need to stop scolding and looking down on the responsible and cautious and start elevating those qualities as definitive of being a good man. The effect of male culture goes even beyond that. Disparities in combat and policing deaths are caused by men excluding women from combat and policing roles. The same is the case in dangerous industries. Women could be doing more construction work, remember that Thai woman earlier? Who do you think is making that difficult for them, and neglecting to step up recruiting and retaining them? Men need to change how they think, if they want to change the outcomes for their lives, and want to actually share the risks of building and maintaining a civilization. This is true also at the other end of the cultural production line. gendering how children are raised also pipelines women away from what we have coded as male roles more than would be the case if we treated girls and boys the same. And two quoque won't work here. For women have been the first to point out that female culture has traditionally been just as toxic or dysfunctional as men's culture still is. Unlike healthy femininity and healthy masculinity, toxic femininity as well as toxic masculinity pressure women toward characters and behaviors that subordinate women to men. For example, nurturing is a synonym of serving, and homemaker is a synonym of servant. Valorizing not being loud or aggressive or risk-taking is valorizing submission. The supposedly feminine virtues of listening and patience both entail subservience to those who don't listen and aren't patient, which are being automatically coded here as what men do. But unlike male culture, female culture has been productively self-critical and reconstructive for some 50+ years. Men seem stuck. Women cannot be blamed for that. They've been trying to help men change it. In short, the Stardusks of the world should be thinking more about culture than biology. They should be thinking how to change their culture to be more functional. And they should be doing this on a basis of actual evidence, not internal mental fantasies, which simply reproduce their myths and biases and thus avoid contact with reality, and thereby avoid productive change. Above all, men should be doing all this collaboratively with women, with critical engagement, rather than sinking into a stagnant cycle of malignant hostility and resentment that not only prevents any progress but even makes it all worse. Dialing back your obsession with violence and sex, and dialing up more meaningful aims and values, would be a good start. So, what then? I will get asked at this point what healthy femininity and masculinity are. But I find this tends to be framed as what should men and women do, what makes someone a better man or woman apart from simply being a better human being. And that is precisely the problem. Modern genders, all of which were invented by imperialist empires, tend to serve this false notion that you should be a better man and a better woman, in some fashion apart from just being a better human being. And this has always been in aid of serving male dominance and the values of hierarchical imperialism. Women must serve men, and men must serve the state, and success is a function of how much power you have in the system, to which everyone must defer, rather than a function of how happy or fulfilled you are. As Britt Marling observed, it's difficult for us to imagine femininity itself, empathy, vulnerability, listening, as strong. Why is that? As such, modern genders are the broken ideas of dead or dying empires. If you honestly go questing for what a real man is, or what a real woman is, you'll find 6, possibly uncomfortable, truths waiting for you at the end of that rainbow. The linking of dominant subordination characteristics to gender is what is toxic. The very notion that women are supposed to be soft, patient, quiet, demure, nurturing, prettied-up homemakers is the very attitude designed to subordinate them to men, who alone are allowed to be hard, impulsive, loud, aggressive, rational, rough-and-tumble warrior providers. The very dichotomy itself is bullshit. At the level of values and character, being a real man or a real woman really just ends up being an excellent human being, undifferentiated by sex or gender in values and character. Both sexes should be courageous, responsible, reliable, cooperative, caring, passionate, confident, ambitious, and rational. What remains is, alas, literally just an aesthetic. Man or woman, you can be demure or loud, patient or impulsive, stoic or emotional, into kids or not, even prettied up or rough and tumble, or either as the mood or occasion suits. Personality is, like everything else, bell-curved and overlapping, with sex differences too small to stereotype. Sex thus has no consistent connection to these things. And gender has no inevitable connection to them either, because gender is arbitrary, mere culture, not biology. Beyond those arbitrary cultural assignments of personality to gender that have no real connection to one's sex, sounding or looking or vibing masculine or feminine really is just a style choice. Whether men wear skirts or dresses or makeup or braid their hair, whether women don't do hair or makeup, or wear tuxedos or bow ties, or chaps and cowboy hats, or whatever, is no more meaningful, and no more connected to one's value or character, than whether one affects a goth style or a preppy style or a new wave or biker style, or whether one is a Trekkie or a hippie or a furry or a punk or a sportsballer or a monk. Therefore we ought to decouple both the fundamental human qualities of character and arbitrary style attributes from gender and sex. At most gender can survive as a style, someone can thus be more or less masculine or feminine, or fluid or non-binary, in presentation, from clothes to body language, even styles of voice and speech. But until men, and women, stop denigrating, subordinating, and emotionally or even physically bullying other men unless they conform to the style, masculinity will forever remain fundamentally toxic, as destructive and lethal to men as to everyone else around them. Femininity has already gotten here. Apart from conservatives struggling desperately to turn back the clock, and the unenlightened still confused about the direction of civilization, a growing plurality of women in free democracies no longer denigrate, subordinate, or emotionally or even physically bully other women for not conforming to the style. Femininity is a choice, not a destiny. Women can affect any style they want, their variations in personality are recognized as human and not some failure or success at being a woman, and actual failure or success at being a woman is literally no different than failure or success at being a human being. Men need to get to the same place. Our civilization is far from accepting these 6 truths, even among women, although progress there is large enough to be quite visible now, and moving apace. But men are not catching up. Men still socially punish men, and even themselves, for not conforming to what is, in the end, just an aesthetic in no way defining of one's character or value to society. Women have almost escaped this. Tradwives still trying to browbeat other women back into the fold are increasingly a societal joke now, and not taken seriously by most women. Men need to get to that same place, laughing at tradmen bullying everyone into an aesthetic they have confused for character, instead of stumping for or submitting to them. Be courageous and strong not because that's being a man, be courageous and strong because that's being an excellent person. The fickle and weak are no less men. They are, rather, just ordinary people. There are many ways to explore what healthy masculinity looks like, example. But in the end, really, it's just being a good human being. As Alice Capel warns, one should not confuse the aesthetic policing of men with the pursuit of better values in men. Certainly the former has to stop, and many women are responsible for perpetuating it, so they need to change, too. But the latter is the more pressing goal. Toxic masculinity is any concept of a man that hurts people, the men themselves, and people around them. Healthy masculinity is any concept of a man that helps people, the men themselves, and people around them, helps them be better selves, have better lives, and enjoy better company. Decoupling aesthetics, looks, clothes, body language, from values and character is an essential first step. Back to the video. Illustrating all my points so far, Stardusk starts right off saying several dumb things like, a man in uniform is not necessarily rich but he is a man who, by the very definition of his trade, is committed to inflicting violence upon the world, and that's why women swoon at men in uniform, circa minute 2. I think firefighters, marching bands, airline pilots, cruise ship captains, and postal workers would disagree. So would men with a fetish for women in the uniform of a schoolgirl or maid, or indeed, soldier or police officer. Clearly there is no factual correlation between the aesthetic effect of a uniform and any propensity or assumption of violence. Of course, not all women are into the uniform thing anyway, while plenty of men are. I'll bet even Stardusk gets emotionally excited by the sight of a man in a snazzy uniform. I don't mean sexually, but simply because uniforms are deliberately designed to have that aesthetic effect. Which is why recruiters attract men with posters of Marines in full dress uniform, a uniform relatively encumbering and useless for combat. It looks awesome. Because it was made to. This illustrates Stardusk's armchair methodology. He doesn't even query whether the things he wants to say match reality. Are uniforms solely associated with violence? Is it that association and not simply their artistic design that people react to? He has this idea that centers violence as the pinnacle of human supremacy, and interprets everything through that lens, without testing his hypotheses even for their coherence much less empirical merit. What else might uniforms, particularly the most affecting uniforms, be associated with that impacts people's sexual and non-sexual attraction to them? For example, might it really be the communication of discipline, reliability, and professionalism? By contrast, when I think about these things, I immediately observe facts in the world contrary to Stardusk's thesis without even doing any research. Do we really think stewardesses are violent? And when I do the research, the results look closer to what I thought than Stardusk thinks. For example, try, why are women attracted to men in uniform, in Google Scholar and see what you get. You might find, as I did, that it draws too many unrelated hits, too many articles using the word uniform in a completely different sense, so to force a fit with purpose I put men in uniform in quote marks to force Google Scholar to select articles with that exact phrase, and to be complete one should then also run a search there for man in uniform. Here is what you get. The results might differ for you, as cookies and time will change them, but as some examples. Topping my results was a peer-reviewed study in fashion theory by Jennifer Craik, The Cultural Politics of the Uniform, which is behind a paywall, and not available on my JPass or Gale accounts, but with some clever search stringing I could reconstruct its general points, which confirm mine. Craik has in fact written up quite a few studies of uniforms and their culture and aesthetics, continuing this trend. Very high on the list was an amusing study in the Journal of Articles in Support of the Null Hypothesis, which I am delighted to learn exists, by Gwyneth Bluntnuss, Kelly Leach Kate, and Heidi Latimer, G.I. Average Joe. The clothes do not necessarily make the man, which found that there is not enough evidence to say conclusively whether females prefer men in military dress versus casual attire anyway. It appears to be an idiosyncratic affectation that men over-remember, a form of availability bias. But their survey of past research, and the discrepancies in their own results, further confirms the findings of Craik. Any effect uniforms do have is not likely a product of their association with violence. Most hits were still irrelevant, but the next most pertinent was a rather enlightening chapter by Alexander Maxwell in Patriots Against Fashion, Clothing and Nationalism in Europe's Age of Revolutions, titled The Discovery of the Uniform, which traces the very idea of a uniform to the 18th century, and explores the actual stated reasons for introducing the concept. It is notable that uniforms arrived so late in human history, which cancels any possibility of their being linked to biological determinism. But history has a lot to say about the reasons for using them and the aesthetics of their construction that supports Crake over Stardusk. With the target phrase in the singular, I also found a great article studying the historical reasons men gave for liking uniforms and designing them the way they did. Philip Hoare, I Love a Man in a Uniform, The Dandy Esprit de Corps, also in Fashion Theory, which I could access and read from home with my local public library Gale account, which provides access to all issues between 2003 and 1 year ago. Which gives a completely different account than Stardusk imagines, and aligns with the findings of Crake et al. This is why we are supposed to study history. The lesson here, besides basic matters of method, like how to check facts, the need to do so, or how to critically evaluate your results, is that we cannot just make shit up from the armchair. If you have theories or questions about history, you need to actually study history, either directly, as a historian, or indirectly, reading the actual findings of real historians. My first peer-reviewed article was on this crucial social role of the historian, and thus of history, for the public. And I am, if you hadn't known, an actual historian. But my skills are only transferable in basics, I still need to rely on specialists outside my own fields. So I know to check what, for example, fashion historians and sociologists have published about uniforms and their aesthetic origins, functions, and impact. I also know how to critically evaluate it, but so should anyone. For my best tutorials on that last point, see. I make this point because Stardusk then commits an even more serious mistake in his invention of a history of labor that does not track anything in reality. Starting at minute 222, he claims that civilization led to currency, fiduciary trade, and modernizing technology, which began to dissolve the protector-provider role for men. As usual, he cites no evidence at all for this account of history. And the obvious facts of history do not support it. Trade predates currency by eons, as do strength-multiplying technologies. The invention of civilization is less important here than the correlated invention of land ownership. Long before that, the principal driver of marriage was access to political resources. Early marriages were marriages of families. Likely from its inception and for tens of thousands of years, marriage appears to have been arranged and familial, not simply a choice of either partner, and more serving the combination of the resources of entire extended families and not merely the combination of the resources of the couple, and was thus less about sex. The ethnographic record is replete with instantiations of non-monogamous marriage. That remained the case for most of human history. But when property became central to that equation, with land and other forms of accumulated wealth, inheritance became the central question, which led to a drive to declare wombs and hence women to be property, leading to patriarchal culture. Men then needed to control women, in order to control their children, in order to control land and wealth. The outcome, upon the rise of civilization and thousands of years after, was that men remained dominant and populated all protective services, military and police, and all top-earning professions, because they forced it to be that way. Women were typically banned from leadership and most leading avenues of trade and commercial success. Even prostitutes were subordinated by laws to a lower-class status with fewer rights. None of this was biological determinism, it was all male fascism. And there is a uniform rule in history that helps you detect this fact. You don't have to legislate biology. If men are, naturally, the providers and women the homemakers, you would never have to force them to be by passing and enforcing laws and customs compelling adherence to these roles. This is thus evidence against Stardusk's entire thesis. Indeed, twice over: first, the need of arbitrary compulsion refutes any possibility of biological determinism; second, there was no resulting decline in Stardusk's imagined roles for men and women, but exactly the opposite. This is when those roles were invented as we know them. Which is the opposite of their decline. We actually here see instead their rise. It is also not true that violence became less and less important, circa minute 240. Civilization actually amped up the human scale and dependence on violence. It forced the entire model of land and naval warfare for the expansion and maintenance of civilization and other forms of societal violence, such as slavery. Prior to this, human societies were generally more peaceful, and wars and intertribal conflict rare and small in scale. Most human food production was not procured by violence. Gathering was central, hunting supplemental, and even that entailed pursuing comparatively helpless prey, not grappling with bears. Farming, beginning with horticulture, and husbandry, herding, had already supplanted the majority of the supply chain before civilization arose to control the land and herds that agro-husbandry then made central to the economy. The response to this was not a decline in demand for male violence, but a horrific rise in demand for male violence. In no way can humans have been biologically evolved for this outcome because all our biological evolution preceded this strange development. Human recourse to violent systems of oppression in reaction to farming was a failure mode, a dysfunctional response to an unfamiliar circumstance we hadn't evolved to cope with, at all, much less well. It is thus notable that the history of progress since then is really a measure of our gradual calming back down. It took thousands of years to make visible progress in getting this toxic recourse to violence, this literal culture of violence, to fade back into something far healthier and productive, both economically and psychologically. We are better off now that we are less violent, approaching our prior evolved state of being, a rare instance of that being a good thing. And yet we are still centuries away from cured, as local and global human violence remains rampant, even if much less so than once was, statistically, per capita. Thus, Stardusk has gotten history all wrong, and in more ways than one. Civilization did not downgrade the economic value of violence, it had exactly the opposite effect. And that upgrading of its value was not a good development but a rather awful one that did humanity no favors. Stardusk's narrative is that a decline in the market value for violence has unnaturally allowed beta males to gain more access to women than should be the case. But history does not track with his narrative. Nor does the science. There is no such thing as alpha and beta males in the sense he means. That was scientifically debunked ages ago, indeed by the very same scientist who erroneously proposed the idea. The science has since found very different realities, undermining the entire concept, especially in humans. Example. I discuss this, and the science, more in my articles on Glover and Peterson. Even where the phenomenon exists, it evinces different results than the naive model embraced by the manosphere. For example, in a primate study of Catherine Jack and Linda Fettigan. One species of Capuchin monkey shows reproductive advantages for alpha male status within the dominated group, but beta males still get mates, just less often, and can even emigrate and become alphas in other groups. And yet there is no relevant correlation between Capuchin and human biology and social organization, or indeed among primates generally. For example, Capuchin sexual dimorphism is far more extreme than human, with around a 30 percentile difference in size, for example, compared to the human 10, and therefore its biology is uninformative for humans. And as Jack and Fettigan observe in their survey, the correlation between male dominance and reproductive success is less than straightforward, in primate studies generally, with results ranging from no correlation to a significant positive or negative correlation depending on the species, seasonality, and/or housing conditions. So, there's nothing to learn here about people. In reality, through all human history, smart men and sociable men have had marketable selection traits, too, and thus competed with large men or dominant men. This is illustrated by the fact that even rape is not adaptive, and that has nothing to do with the biologically evolved preferences of women anyway, to the contrary, it defies them. And yet any male dominance advantage in mating has tended to be coercive. Landowning civilization has tended to limit women in choosing whom they can have sex with, rather than respecting any biologically innate choice they may have had. Women's liberation in mate selection is relatively new for civilization now, and another rare case of an improving return to how things most likely used to be. And yet, either way, there is no evidence that a man of smaller build who is simply a reliable partner, responsible and intelligent and pro-social, was ever denied access to mates. Which should be biologically obvious, that's why those kinds of men still abundantly exist. There is no evidence even that women as a whole have ever preferred large dominating men as mates over average men who were merely reliable. This should also be biologically obvious, that's why almost all of the sexual dimorphism between male-sexed and female-sexed bodies is so small, at mere 10 percentiles. On average women clearly prefer men who aren't maxing the bell curve, but who are, in fact, closer to women, men who are just a little larger and more domineering than the average for women, not overly so. Conversely, quite enough men clearly like larger and domineering women to keep them around as well, hence the bell curve overlap still produces quite a lot of them. This is why it matters that the trend in hominins, of which we are the last surviving species, has been a steady reduction of sexual dimorphism, which reached current levels before civilization arose. Which means women's preferences for less dimorphic men have been driving this reduction for millions of years. It therefore cannot have suddenly changed when civilization arose. And therefore nothing Stardusk is arguing is even possible. This holds even given the fact that decreased dimorphism was partly in response to women's bodies needing to be larger to survive more births owing to the increased brain size that comes with increased intelligence. Women still developed a preference for men closer to their size, and thus men were not selected to be yet larger, like, for example, gorillas. Moreover, the decline in dimorphism ranges well across mere stature, including even such things as emotionality. On every metric, men and women have been evolving to be more like each other. They have also developed to provide a considerable overlap in distributed traits, including strength. Examples. Conclusion. Stardusk is obsessed with strength because he is obsessed with violence, which he, ominously, connects to sex. This is not a profile to be proud of. Which produces his misogynistic thesis that women are dysfunctionally and incorrectly mating with beta males, now because their soulless mercenary hearts no longer attract them to alpha males, except for illicit sex. When they cheat on the betas they are only luring with sex to steal their resources. All of which is built on totalizing fallacies contrary to all evidence. All women are one way, all men are another way, men and women only contribute one thing, and so on, as well as on a completely made-up and provably false understanding of human history and ethnography, and a complete disregard of what relationships even are. He sees women as having no use than for sex and therefore as exploiters of men's labor rather than contributing substantial labor to the households they join. Contrafactual notions I will demonstrate and explore in part 2. Above all, his methods are garbage. No quality research. No self-questioning. No falsification tests. No critical source analysis. No competence at logic. One thing Stardusk claims is true: strength, the one substantial advantage men are more often born with, has less value as a resource in a modern society. But only someone like him finds this as grounds for panic, rather than relief. This is a good thing. We shouldn't be whinging about it. We should be eagerly adapting to it. To be civilized literally means to prioritize the intellectual over the physical. You needn't abandon the physical, and it will always be of use. But you will do more with the intellectual. Compassion, reliability, competence, ingenuity, wisdom, passion, sociability, determination. These are more valuable now, both for your own welfare and for finding love, and, yes, even sex. So get on that. Whereas embracing totalizing and counterfactual worldviews of abject hate will sink you. Get out of there. Stat. What I have covered so far backgrounds everything I will discuss next, where in part 2 I provide a complete Fisk of Stardusk's Thinking-Ape video.